Hello everyone, this is Dan, and this is introducing The Reality Exchange by James Vigor. Very excited about this one. Winter Starling, his protagonist, his main character, is one of my favourite characters in modern science fiction. So I do urge you all to go out and grab yourself a copy of The Reality Exchange, and within one page you will realise why. So yes, I'm very much looking forward to this showcase. There's a handful of tasters coming up to whet your appetite for James's showcase, but the full showcase will premiere on Friday evening on the 14th of October at 8 p.m. as part of our M.A.B.L.E event. So be there. That's Friday evening, the 14th of October, 8 p.m. onwards. So grab yourself a beer and come and join us for that. And like I said, here are a handful of tasters to whet your appetites.
The Reality Exchange by James Vigor. Small-time smuggler, Winter Starling, becomes a pawn in a bigger game. It's not what she wants, but no one gives her a choice. Her hitherto peaceful existence, living with her parents who own a mine close to Jova, a huge oceanside spaceport, is torn apart. Mining the much sought-after mineral asareite is a legal activity. Selling it for onward shipment to Earth, not so much. But where Winter's skills were once all focused on evading security and slipping her illicit shipments to her regular customers inside the port, things take a sudden and sinister turn. She has never been to Earth, never been into space, never wanted to travel beyond the bounds of her home planet, Arali. But suddenly, she's a pawn in someone else's game. The spinal implant that keeps her alive has made her a useful tool in someone else's armoury. She must leave Jova and hitch a ride to Earth, and she must do it fast. Just finding someone to take her seems an insurmountable problem, but it turns out to be trivial in comparison to what is to come. And what neither Winter nor the person blackmailing her can know is that what makes her a useful pawn in one person's game will make her useful to someone else in ways that no one could have predicted.
Here's a debut science fiction novel called The Reality Exchange by James Vigor. It's not, again, particularly my taste in stories. It could be adapted rather easily to the script for a Hollywood action film. But I have to admit that once I started, I couldn't put the thing down. Forgive the cliche. James Vigor knows how to keep the reader engaged, not least by ending each chapter on a cliffhanger. And he isn't afraid to kill off a lot of the good guys during the carnage. It's brave and committed writing for a debut novel. The setting is futuristic, with interstellar travel and trade and an intergalactic war, but the war only forms the background. The core of the story is a hostage situation, driven purely by greed. The protagonist, who is called Winter Starling, has character and courage. By trade, she's a smuggler, which is rather fun. But almost throughout the novel, her actions are controlled by other people, and only intermittently does she show agency. It's unusual for an all-action story, but rather to my surprise, it works. The beleaguered spaceship captain, Orson, is forced by circumstances to make concessions incompatible with his principles, and gradually, bit by bit, he loses control of his crew and his passengers, and ultimately of himself. This deterioration of authority is very well drawn. The pirate captain, aptly named Grim, is motivated only by desire for money, and she's a pragmatist, adapting to changes in the situation in order to ensure that she'll profit in the end. In her, Mr. Vigor has portrayed the ultimate cynic. At the end of the novel, we learn something that opens the door to a possible sequel. If the sequel appears, then despite my usual avoidance of the kind of science fiction, I think I'll read it. James Vigor is an author with a distinctive voice and a fine ability to control an intricate plot without letting the pace drop. Well done, that man.
Melody muses on pixies and gets an answer she didn't expect. The Reality Exchange by James Vigor is an exciting space adventure suitable for all ages. It whisks us off into the future of virtual reality. Oh, and the spaceships have great names too. The incident that I asked the author about takes place aboard the Shameless Renegade. I'm all about the animals when delving into these books, but this time I'm going to approach closer to the human animal than I usually do, because I just have to find out about this one. There's a character in the Reality Exchange called Paul who keeps bugs in jars. His bug collection is not central to the plot, but it intrigues me. And in particular the contents of one jar that contains a small winged human, a pixie. In a throwaway comment, we learn that it is presumed to be a hoax, but I need to know more. So here's what I ask James Vigor. The pixie in the jar in Paul's collection, did he ever find out where it came from? Here's James's answer. This was the scene that introduced Paul for the first time in a simulation on the Shameless Renegade right near the start of their journey. He says that the pixie was one of many inaccuracies he found with the simulation of the Amazon rainforest. In fact, he couldn't find a single one of the creatures that should have been there. He insisted Graham should look into it on his behalf, but I imagine once he was out of the simulation it became the least of his concerns. He probably mentioned it to the crew at some point, but I doubt they were feeling very helpful, so no, I don't think he ever really got an answer. All of the Renegade simulations were bought from third-party developers, probably quite cheaply. Anyone could have built some fantastical take on the rainforest, and the Renegade crew would have done very little, if anything, to check its legitimacy before installing it. I don't believe they would care enough. Another answer would be that it was a deliberate effort of theirs to wind him up. It was clear to Paul that the crew held him in low regard, so I think he suspected them of ruining a perfectly good rainforest simulation with all this fantasy nonsense just to irk him. But of course the real answer is that the pixie came from me. I included it for a couple of reasons. The first was to explore, in a very minor way, the idea that these simulations could do anything, build any world. The SSR system has the potential to let people experience things they otherwise never could. That's something that takes a back seat when the story kicks off in earnest. So the pixie was a small way to stimulate the reader's imagination about what a system like this could really do. The second purpose was, to be honest, pure self-indulgence. I love fantasy, and I felt like I had to include a nod to it in some form. I have a particular fascination for exploring scale in fantasy races, from fairies to giants and everything in between. It's something I could talk on at length, so perhaps that's a subject for another blog someday. For now, I'll just say it felt like an opportunity for a bit of fun, and one I couldn't pass up. Well, that has to rate as one of the best answers I've had during these musings. The idea of taking an opportunity just for some fun is something I can wholly endorse. And I love the way James brings it all down to earth, not that they were on Earth at this point, with an explanation about the routine and sometimes lazy downloading and installing of apps without proper verification. Yes, of course that's going to go on. Dodgy apps don't stop when the sci-fi starts, and dodgy apps are something we can all relate to.
By the time Winter arrived home, the sky was nearly at its darkest, the distant blue star climbing high above the horizon. The air and the heat forgot their daytime hostility, and a soft breeze cooled the sweat on Winter's skin. The house was dark. It wasn't that late. Someone should be up. Perhaps they'd gone out somewhere, or maybe they'd just turned in early. As she turned off the engine and dismounted, Winter caught the gleam of vehicles in the driveway. Both their cars were there. They'd turned in early. She tiptoed her way to the front door. She peered at the thumbprint lock. It was offline. Cracks were visible in the casing, exposing the wiring and circuitry. A chill swept over her. Winter placed a hand against the door and gently pushed. It swung open, smoothly and quietly. Then, with a loud crack, it collapsed from its hinges and thudded against the wall. She stood silently and swallowed deeply. The fingers that had been hovering by the handgun on her hip now tightened around the grip as she drew the weapon silently from its holster and disabled the safety. Raising it in front of her, she took a step inside. In the hallway, tables and bookshelves had been yanked away from the walls, thrown over, pulled apart, and smashed to pieces. There were holes in the walls from which bare strands of wire trailed out, fraying at the ends. She inched forward. Was anyone in the house? Desperate to find her parents alive and well, she strained to listen for any noise. There wasn't much in walking distance of this place, and the only vehicles outside belonged to the family, so her parents probably hadn't escaped by themselves, and anyone else who had been here had most likely driven off. She couldn't depend on probabilities, though. She kept her guard up. Winter pushed past overturned furniture squeezing down the hall, then entered the living area. She was struck with a blast of cold air that punched through a wide crack in the window. Shreds of torn fabric lay amongst scattered feathers. They must have once been the cushions. The coffee table lay on its side with one leg missing and the others split apart. The walls were bare, and as she stepped further inside, the crunch of glass and wood underfoot told her what had become of the pictures that had once adorned them. It looked more like a battlefield than a break-in. Winter didn't want to disturb the place. There was no one in here, and that was all she needed to know. She backed out into the hall, trying to keep her hands steady as she raised her weapon again. She moved towards the back of the house, then froze. The quiet scrape of wood against wood. It was coming from the kitchen. She adjusted her grip on the gun, her finger on the trigger. As she approached, she could see the door lying on the floor, torn off its hinges. As she crossed the threshold, she detected a single faint clicking sound behind her, followed by a metallic whirring. Winter braced herself, waiting as the mechanical hum drew nearer, then whirled to face it with her weapon outstretched. A heavy strike to the head stopped her short. The last thing she remembered was her gun clattering to the floor, and a bright blue light in her eyes.